Yeah, welcome to the 11th masterclass of that we've been running for the last couple of weeks. In these tutorials, I try and explain some feature of the science-based platform and how we can sort of pull the most out of it. This week we'll be continuing on from last week's environment because we put that together. It was quite nice, and I'd like to finish that up. So I've actually spent a little bit more time over the weekend on it, and to start with, I will show you what we are doing. So, fingers crossed, you now have the screen. And this is the environment that we were looking at last week. As you can see, it's changed up a bit. I've stripped out some of the more procedural building parts because I haven't quite got those finished up. And I have actually dotted the terrain with a bit more vegetation, played around with the vertex painter to paint a bit more grass and things onto the various rocks and trees. And I've added an entire back section into the region. So this region I still anticipate making up as a private room template. We'll likely release that as part of our 1-year anniversary, which will be coming up in November, just in the middle of the month. So we'll give everyone who comes to that a copy of this room as a little bit of a teaser. So, as you can see here, we've added a bit more to it, and I'll just go through a few of the things that I've played with. One of the things that I have set up is a full day-night cycle in here. What we can do is we can actually show that. If I go find the day-night cycle, this is using our standardized day-night cycle that comes with the editor pack. Just search for day-night cycle as a component, and it'll come up here. We'll tick on preview, and when we've got preview enabled, we can actually scrub through the whole environment. Now when we hop in world, and I'm going to do that, actually, can I? Yes, I will do that. I will log in world at the same time, and we can sort of see how this looks a little bit as well. So I'm just going to set this back to roughly here. Now, to make the day-night cycle work most effectively, there is a couple of tips and tricks. The first is that for the baked lighting system that we use, we're actually going to switch from mixed lighting over to real-time lighting. Now, if you remember from my very early classes, we discussed the differences between the two, and I generally recommended that you stick to mixed lighting unless you had the scene's lighting dramatically changing over time. Now, in the case of a full day-night cycle, the scene's lighting does change dramatically over time. You get the transition from day to night. And what the real-time lighting does is it actually bakes not the lighting data directly into the textures like it does with mixed lighting, which is kind of very static. With real-time lighting, actually what it does is it calculates the directions that light flows through the scene. And by doing that calculation, it basically can compute how an object that's reflected will impact. So if we find a dark section in here, say here, if I bounce a very strong light off here from about this angle, it should bounce over perhaps back onto there. And we'll be able to see that in here. So if I grab a spotlight here, and we're just going to ramp this one up. I'll set the range quite far, and I'm going to ramp the intensity all the way up. So as you can see, immediately what's happening is that the light is bouncing off there and arriving on the other objects. This also applies in the viewer itself, so if you have a furniture item or something that's got a light attached to it, it will actually take advantage of the baked lighting in the environment. That as you sort of add these bright elements, it will actually bake and bounce the lights off the side. Likewise, it's all affected by color and all the rest of it, so it gives you that sort of realism. Now in this case I've got an absurdly powerful light, but for a more natural color you will see the subtle highlights appear, and obviously the stronger the light, the more influence that will have over the environment. Other benefit of baked lighting is that static objects, that say you've got a box that is with an emissive material, those can actually also bounce lighting into the scene, and the bounce lighting will impact on the changes to that object. So, for instance, if you go back to our older masterclass on music visualizers, we did some materials that brighten up and darken down. When you use the pre-computed or real-time global illumination, those can sort of have those similar bounce effects in real time. Okay, so that's the first thing we've done, is we have baked that solution. Now there is probably one caveat here I will apply to using the real-time global illumination, and that is that the bake times can be quite extensive. I did this scene overnight. I don't know exactly how many hours it took to bake, but it will take a few. The bigger your scene, the longer it will take to bake. There are ways of trimming that down. If you search for Unity Unity's own tutorials on Google. You just search for Unity 3D followed by Global Illumination tutorial. They actually have an extensive set of pages which cover how you can reduce those bake times down to a couple of minutes. I have not yet applied that to this scene because it does require a bit of manual work tagging important objects and culling unimportant objects and a few other bits and pieces, which just takes a bit too much time, and I'd rather just run it overnight, which is what I have done. Other things I've applied in here since then, I have been using my favourite tool at the moment is one called Ivy Generator, and I can just show that off. It's called Real Ivy, and I can just show off some nifty parts of this one. If we want to say grow some ivy around these rocks in this building, maybe I'll do it here. I'll just go to my preset which I made for this scene. I can just click somewhere on the scene and do this. This is another paid asset. It's about $15, I think. I'm not quite sure on the price, but it does have the rather cool feature that it can just sort of blend out these procedural vegetation clumps pretty easily. I can just stop that growth right there, and you can immediately see we've got something quite cool just growing through the scene there. No, I'm not going to leave that one there because I think it's a little bit out of place with the rest of the scene construction, but as you can see, I've sort of been using it for draping ivy all over this bridge, these things. Incidentally, if your camera clips when you get too close and you want to avoid that, if you just select an object that's smaller, hit F, it'll focus on that and it'll change the clipping distances. The reason for that is that when you're working on large objects, say one of these rocks, and you want to focus on it, then it sort of controls the speed at which the camera moves. It also means the frustum will be more adequately calibrated for that kind of object. I'll go back to a small one for here. Okay. Alright, so the next thing that I've done here is I've added a Cloudbox shader. Now this is the one that I provide in the editor pack. I've just called it Adam's Sky. You can see here that the shader has basic clouds and things built into it. The key with this skybox shader is, as you'll notice, if I turn on animated materials, you'll see that it is actually a fully animated two-plane cloud shader. It'll give you the basics of what you want for clouds. Now there is some options for more interesting clouds, either particle systems or fog volume when we get it behaving fully. Will provide sort of much higher quality cloud systems. But for now, this one works fairly well, and it will respond to the position of the sun. So if we work with the day-night cycle again, go to find my day-night object. If we scrub through the timeline here, you'll see that the clouds will actually respond appropriately with the lighting in the scene, which is just a nice little perk. Incidentally, to get that to behave, you do need to go to the window, go to lighting, which is down here at the bottom, go to lighting settings, and click on the scene. You'll see there's a tab for the sun source. You just drag your directional light in there, and that will be updated onto the material that we're using, so it'll always be the first light in the scene that's the one that the Cloudbox shader uses. Now, as with all things in space, if you don't like the way my shader works, you can write your own, or you can take mine and go ahead and do whatever you like with it. I'll just untick that. So if you go to the, I think it's under Adam Clouds box. It comes in the sample art directory. You'll see that the shader is actually packed in there. I've got a couple of variants of it as well, but you can just open this up in your favorite text editor, and I don't know what my favorite text editor is currently configured to. I think it's Atom. You'll just see all the source codes attached to it. It's pretty straightforward to edit shaders if you are a programmer. If you're not a programmer, there are some tools on the asset store that let you write shaders without having to know what they are. Obviously, the editing a shader is easier than building it from scratch, but all the sources and things are provided with the editor pack. While I am here, I'm just going to log into this region, which will take me a second. We shan't log in with that account. Alright. Okay. Alright, so next things that we've done is we've added reflection probes to the environment. So if I add a very shiny object, and we will talk through those today because I think that's a topic worth covering. Go for metals. I've got the way of really shiny metals. There we go. This is a particularly shiny object. You'll see that we've got reflections of the environment baked in. Now, one thing you will notice is that if we play with the day-night again, oops, you'll notice that the reflections do not update with the day-night changes, so overall things will be too reflective at night. You can see that in this scene right now because these objects all have that sort of weird sheen to them. That is because the light probes in this scene, the reflection probes in this scene are baked way too bright, as you can see there. We're in an area of the scene where I have baked very dark reflection probes even during the day, which is this little nook over here. You don't get that weird sheen. Now, the question is, how do we fix this? There is a couple of ways we can play with this one. I'm just going to set my day-night back to something normal. We have a component in the editor pack called the reflection probe updater. So if I find my reflection probes in here, which you can see I've got six of them, I have attached this script, which is the reflection probe updater. Now, the reflection probe updater basically will just update the reflection probe at runtime, so it'll actually calculate it from the viewer itself. It doesn't need to be baked into the scene. The benefit of doing things this way is also that means we can up the resolution of the image without upping the download size of your regions, because reflection probes can be quite expensive when they're baked from a file size perspective. And the second thing is that it will periodically update. How frequently the updates is up to you. There is a setting called target update interval, and that basically is seconds, and it's how many seconds between updates it should do. It won't necessarily do it every 30 seconds. What it will do is it will first calculate a small offset randomly from 0 to 30, then it will run on that frame, and then it'll run every 30 seconds from then after. And that'll stagger the load across, so if you've got lots of them, it won't generate all your reflection probes on the same frame, which would give a frame rate drop. By doing it this way, we can sort of spread it across the spectrum. Now, there is a priority field. The priority field is basically used when you have lots of reflections and things updating in the same frame. If priority is high, it will always update first, and then if it's medium, it'll update if only a couple have run in this same frame. If it's low, it will basically ignore the update until such time that no other updates have run in that frame. And by doing that, again, it's just useful for staggering things. So if you have lots of objects that are updating, then it will make sure that your priority will make sure that the user's frame rate remain relatively smooth. Finally, you've got a couple of options on your reflection probes. Up until now, up until the editor pack 11, which we have just given out a pre-release copy in our developer chat, you could not use the real-time section. To do the same thing under the old one, you have to use the custom setting instead of real-time. But you can use that in conjunction with the reflection probe updater to sort of keep your reflections up to date. Now, the other things that we have done in here for lighting is making sure that avatar and other lighting sort of consistently flows through the scene. And we've done that using reflection probes. Sorry, not reflection probes, light probes, which are another type of probe. So if I go for light probes, you can find my object, which has got the probes on it. Now, what these do, as you can see, there's a whole bunch scattered through the scene. I used our nav mesh light probe baker. I discussed that again, I think, in the second lighting tutorial, how to use that one. This one, again, we've done the same thing, and we've used the light probes to basically generate a set of points throughout the scene that should be sampled for lighting. And these probes effectively, when you've got things that aren't baked in the scene but you want them to be impacted by baked lighting, reflection probes basically act like a little surface that's invisible in the scene that picks up the ambient lighting from the baking solution. And that ambient lighting will then be used for real-time objects. So, for instance, if we grab a cube in this scene, you can see this is very well lit, and that's because it's picking up the lighting from a bunch of places. It's even lit a little bit on the background. So even though there is a baked lighting and there's no lighting coming from the ground, the reflection probes are using the information that's available to calculate some lighting. And as we change this around, you'll see that the baked lighting is actually still impacting the object. Now, this will be most pronounced if I take this through this arch here. I believe there's some darker reflection probes inside it. You'll see immediately that the baked lighting, well, I have to maybe avoid the shadows, but as this gets further in, you can see it gets a bit darker. Hopefully, as we get out here, it'll lighten back up a bit. So even though it's still fully shadowed, you can see there is a color spectrum change as it goes through, and it'll be picking up things like the environmental lighting, which is going to be the skybox in this particular scene, through to various other things. Now this is most impactful on your own avatar. It means that if your avatar is standing next to something that's very bright green, for example, it will pick up some of that reflected green light and look more natural. Now there is one more lighting related thing we've done here, and that is the waterfalls. Now the waterfalls can't take advantage of baked lighting, unfortunately, and that's because they're transparent, and it doesn't tend to look very good. It can be done. You can bake lighting onto transparency, but I found the results generally are not worth it. So I've actually made these not lighting static, and instead what I've done is I've used light probes again, but I've used a few of them. Now one object can be lit by lots of probes instead of just one, and to do that you use something called a light probe proxy volume, which you can see. This little icon here designates that it's got one attached to it, and you can see that one there. And what this does is it basically builds a little bit of a cage, and that cage, it samples the light at regular intervals, and it'll blur between the nodes over the whole object. You can set the number of objects that it's, or number of sample points it's got through here. So in this case, I'm sampling 2 side to side, so I'm sampling 1 on the edge, 1 on the edge, and down the bottom I'm sampling 8, so it's sampling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all out there to the top, from the bottom to the top. And finally backwards I've got 2, so it's just sampling there, 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 there. Basically building a rectangular prism with a bunch of nodes on it that have got 8 on the vertical and then 2 on each of the other ones. And basically that will mean that ambient lighting from the scene will be transferred onto here, even the baked indirect lighting. Now again, those need to be updated like reflection probes as the lighting system changes through the scene, and to do that there is a similar component to the reflection probe updater, and it's called the light proxy updater, and that has exactly the same profile. It's much faster to calculate than the full reflection probes because it doesn't need to render the whole scene, but nonetheless, if you've got thousands of them in the scene, do be careful with your update intervals and things to make sure you're spreading that out appropriately. Again, the priority values will be read to determine if something should be updated in a particular frame. Using lower priority values on things leaves room in that frame for other things. So in this case, I'm updating the lighting every 5 seconds. Because the day-night cycle is not too quickly moving in here, that should be fine. Now, if you've got a scene where the lighting needs to update immediately, so for instance you've got very active moving large lights in the scene, you can set the time to 0. When the time is 0, it will update every single frame, which will give you those benefits. Finally, the last thing I've done in here is I've tweaked the water a little bit. I am using Sumono in here. I've got that all set up. But otherwise, apart from the sort of the added builds and things, it's mostly the same as it was before. All of our waterfalls and things are the same as they were. I'm just going to log in here. I have to ignore my rapidly disco home region. I'll just go to this one. Actually is open to the public if you want to take a look at some point in the future. I'll just hop over here while we work on this one. We can actually show you sort of some of how this looks. I don't know. The night cycle on this one is not quite as good as the day cycle, but I'm hoping that the last update I put through is going to make that look a bit better. There's a few things that we sort of need to tweak in here. One of them is actually more accurately fitting the reflection probes. So I showed you those in the scene. I can show you where those are going. We're going to have to sort of add a few more into this scene just to cover off the bits that I missed, because I did actually miss quite a few of them. So I'll just find those. These ones. I might actually move those onto a new object. So I'll just grab I'll create an empty object. I'm just going to set this to 0, 0, 0, and this is how I typically group things when working in a project. So I'll just grab all those reflection probes and just move them into my new group. That's odd. I can't move them while I've got a selection active. Okay, so those are all just in there for convenience sake. So what we can see here is I've got a reflection probe over the river. I've got that more accurately placed just because I wanted the lighting there to be more accurate. I've got one a little bit larger covering the waterfall, immediately this area. This has got a lower priority than this one. Actually, it's the other way around. That should be fixed. I'll set that priority to 25. So this reflection probe will take precedent over this one. There is a blend distance set between the two of 5 meters, which means that towards the edge it'll blend with every other reflection probe nearby, up to 5 meters away from the edge of the bounds. So from this line, it'll actually continue to impact objects further on. We have a large reflection probe, as you can see right here, covering most of the scene. Now, when you get in world, which hopefully we are almost there. Unfortunately, my internet is a little bit under the weather at the moment. Unfortunately, I got shifted onto another ISP, so I've got a busy shift that back. Okay, so the reflection probe covers the entire scene. Unfortunately, it only covers up to a certain height. So actually, we will notice at some point that the reflection probe begins to kick in rather dramatically. There is a blur to it, but I'm not quite sure how high I've set this one. Actually, maybe this does cover it. It's a very large probe, but let's have a look. I'll set that down to... Okay, let's see here. Yes, I thought that was too low. So what's happening is that we're getting no reflection probes are actually covering this top area of the scene. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to expand that. So our scene is going to be 300 high. Hopefully that's high enough. Nope, this is quite a tall scene. 400 meters high. Is that going to cover it? No. 500 meters high, there we go. Okay, so this is now going to cover the full box. And we'll just set the size now back to 5,000. Okay, so this reflection probe, for reference, is sampling the lighting from this particular point here and applying it to the scene universally when nothing else is around. Now, I'm not 100% sure this particular point is the best point in the scene to grab from. Among other things, it's a little bit busy and it's a little bit close to everything else. So what I might do is I might just set that to there. And this way we've got something that's a little bit more general. Now, we might want to play around with this one as well and add some more probes closer into particular points to get more accurate points for there, but okay, we'll do this one for now. Okay, we have another light probe, which I guess I've covered here just to try and dampen the lighting down inside this cave, because as you can see the cave has quite a bit of lighting towards the top, and I did want to remove that one, but unfortunately I've set the importance here too low, so I've set it to 50, 40, okay, so that's now applying this lighting onto here. I guess that must be right. It's because the water there is quite bright. It's having that impact. We'll try and clean that up as well. I think I might need to add a proxy volume to here in order to get that. In fact, that's exactly what I need to do. So the first thing I'll do is add a proxy volume. I'm going to add a proxy updater as well. So it's to medium priority, and I'll give it a 5-second update time. Incidentally, that tick box for update on load means that it will update when it first loads the scene as well, which is generally what you want. Okay, so there we go. Now you can actually see my probe proxy points that this one's actually calculating from as well. So it'll give you that grid of every point that it's sampling for static lighting, and as you can see over here, it should be quite dark. It's not quite dark enough, so we might need to play with the material properties as well a little bit to try and get this one to look the way we want, because obviously the terrain here should be this colour, should be this black towards the back of the cave, and then as it gets out, the baked lighting should influence and brighten it up a bit. Okay, so it's set a probe distance of, as you can see, of 0.25, which means it's placed a probe automatically every 25 centimeters. I'm going to change that because that's too many. The more probes it has, the slower it runs. So I might set it to... Oh, it's the other way around. It's probes per unit, so that was one every 4 meters. Sorry, not every 25 centimeters. So I might set it to 0.125. Which I think is giving me mostly what I want. I guess we'll see how this looks. So I'm just going to play with this. It's 0.87 right now. I'm just wondering whether it's because it's transparent that it's not pulling out the accurate data or not. We'll just do a quick test on this one. Okay, so that's looking better, although the highlights are still quite strong, and I think that's coming off the sorry, that's coming off the sunlight that's doing that. We'll just try and get this to sort of pick up this darkness that's in the cave. That's my ideal point here. Well, that could be an option too. It's an alternate strategy. It does give me what we want, but I'm not sure it quite carries the same look. That water is a bit too crystal clear. We might be able to combine these two effects actually. What I might do is I might copy the object and add a second element below it. Incidentally, with the proxy volumes, if you've got lots of objects that are in the same location, you can actually share a proxy volume between the two, and that will save the rendering cost of building another proxy volume out into the environment. Well, I do like that effect kind of. I wonder how that looks when it's animated. That's going to be the magic question here. It's not quite as nice as the old one. So I might go back to transparent. How does the fade option look? Again, we're just going to have to play around with this. It's unfortunately, I think it might be the case that the reflection probe in here is too bright, and that is actually impacting it. In fact, I wonder if I bake that one out, whether it'll how it will look, because that's really the look we're going for right there. Just obviously with the appropriate levels of highlights. So I might grab you and then see what happens. So it's baked. Bake it. Just give it a second. These ones can take a little bit of time depending on what resolution and things, and how much stuff you've got in your project. A larger project can sometimes slow down a little bit, and this one's huge. Okay, that's looking better to me. Immediately looking better. Let's have a look at how this looks. So set that back to real time. Okay. Now this actually would have, if updated automatically, because we've got the reflection probes calculating at runtime in our actual scene. But let's see how this looks now with back to transparent. Okay, so we're not picking up the whiteness from there. I think it must be coming through the normal lighting system. So let's see what we can do here. Just simply bring the lighting down. But that does look not too bad. Maybe we can get the best of both worlds. So I'm just going to duplicate this one. I've set it over the top. And that gives it a little bit of a slick motion blur effect, having two of these together. Especially when it's animated, it will look good. So I'm just going to grab this material, I'm going to duplicate this. Just give it a second. It's probably a bit faster on your projects. Okay, so here we go. Now that this waterfall 5, we've still got the animation that will still apply even though we've swapped the material. I'll just set that back up to bright, but this one is going to be with that cutout that we had before. Just wondering how this might look. Bright still. unfortunately is not quite doing what I want. That's okay. I may settle on where we've got it here, because I think that result actually looks pretty good. What we do need to do is just sort out this obvious clipping between the top of the waterfall and the bottom. So, what do we need to do for this? The easiest way to do it is probably just distraction. That is typically the way that when we run into sort of a problem that something doesn't look quite right, easiest way is just to break it up a bit. So that's below the surface, but still there. We've got a particle system which is right there already, that will give some breakup. I just want to try and get this harshness a little bit less obvious. Okay. Unless you're actually going out to hunt for this, that probably isn't quite so obvious anymore. Maybe a little bit, maybe a third one will do. There we go. Alright, almost. Just keep applying with this one. It's cheating, but it does work. And as far as I'm concerned, that's an entirely valid strategy. Okay, we've hidden that successfully. All right, so next things. I see I've got a couple of questions and things in the general chat. Okay, all right. All right. So moving on. I'm happy with that now. It gives us a slightly more realistic effect on the top of the river there. It still looks like the tropical paradise we're going for. Okay, next things. Something that I want to play with, that I've wanted to play with in these tutorials for a while, is actually something called a platform zone. And we're going to pair that with a buoyancy script. But first, we've actually got to tag an environment for water. Water zones are something we've added to tag areas as containing water, and that means that the physics engine will pick them up and handle them appropriately when you've got a component on them called a buoyancy component. So here I'm just going to add this, which is a cube. Actually, I don't even need a cube. I'll just do it with a blank game object. I create an empty game object, and I add a component called water zone. And immediately you can see that it brings out a bunch of handles and things that we can drag around to place water within a scene. This is picked up through the new modular vehicle components. They use the water zone, and we also have the buoyancy component will also pick this up directly. So immediately we've got that little box, and we're just going to make this big. Set this to 100 high and 1000. Now, because we've got Simono in the scene, there is an alternative mode for Simono, but this should work in conjunction. So, as we can see here, I'm just going to try and line the shoreline up, the color difference. As you can see, it'll tint the terrain a little bit around when you've got the water zone selected. I just want to line this up with where Simono is going. Because the water is moving up and down, it's not going to be quite in sync, but we'll try and get this to roughly the average point, which I think might be around there-ish. You probably want to go on the lower side if you're using a third-party water package like Simono. The Water 4 system that already exists in Unity, this will be calculated accurately for Water 4 automatically, and we probably will do the integrations with Aquarus and other water systems at some point in the future as well, so that we can get more accurate buoyancy. That's the first thing we're going to do, and the second thing we're going to do is going to add our object, and we're going to add a platform zone to this one. This is a neat little component that we added in a couple of editor packs back that basically let you drive avatar movement from a moving object. So to show how that one works best, we will add this, and I'm going to use a little bit of cheating in the editor pack just to show you how this works. Obviously it works better with an actual vehicle, so I'm just going to add an object here. I'm going to add a rigid body component to it. The rigid body basically allows the the object to be interacting with the physics system. I think we covered that in the vehicles tutorial, but effectively it says that this is a physical object. This can move around the scene independently. I'm going to leave is kinematic tick to here, so it won't move around at start until we actually release that parameter. And finally, I'll release that through the involved tools, because why not? I'll add a clickable activator to it. This is going to make it clickable. I'm just going to drag the rigid body component in. Go to rigid body, and we should have a parameter for is kinematic, and I'm just going to tick there to untick, so as soon as you click on this object in world, it will become physical and begin to interact with the environment. We're going to finally finish off with a buoyancy. Oops, not that buoyancy. We're going to add our buoyancy. There we go. Now, it's got a parameter for a water body. You don't need to include that anymore. It used to be required, but is no longer. Alright, and we're going to leave the other settings alone. This will basically make it a buoyant object as far as the physics system is concerned. So when it gets in the water, it's going to start bouncing around a bit. Other than that, we should be good to go. Oh, finally, sorry, I'm going to add I'm going to add a child to it. I'm going to add a platform zone. And this requires a trigger to be attached to it. So I add a box collider, clicked is trigger, and immediately you can see that sort of resized to the parent there. We'll just offset it a little bit. And basically this is when the avatar's feet are inside this zone, it's going to lock the avatar to the movements of the parent. So I'll set that there. And we'll give it a bit of room just in case the avatar gets knocked out a bit. In fact, I'll make that a bit higher. I don't know how this is going to react with the bounciness. This will actually also allow the avatar to twist on its various axes, so just beware. It will, on exiting, reset the avatar's alignment, but it can let the avatar tilt, which is usually not advisable. Okay, so we have our thing, and we'll just give it a material of some sort. What have I got in here? There we go. Maybe not the prettiest of objects, but we'll just save the scene. And as usual, we're just waiting for Unity to warm up for the first preview play of the day. Incidentally, this is our scene with the full day-night cycle. So as you can see, this is sort of how it looks. This is towards the end of the day because the light is on the other side. But as you can see, our waterfall and the rest of it are all now we have a bit of a haze in here. This is actually done using the post zone. There is a tick box for haze objects, and you can play around with that to set an atmospheric scattering based haze. It's not really terribly realistic, but you can make some cool effects using it. The alternative is to use volumetric lights, which give you sort of similar effects. So we'll leave this one open. We can poke back at it in a minute. I think it's on an 8-minute cycle to go through the full day night. Actually, it might be 15 minutes, but we'll still get to see the whole thing. So I'll tab back to Unity, which should be ready by now. Oh no, it's busy saving. So we can show off a little bit of the waterfall. It does look better during the daytime. This is because this has not been affected by the lights in this particular version of the build. The next version we upload will have the particles affected by lights. To do that, in the particle system, there is a property called use probes. You do want to actually set it to use light probes. Otherwise, what's going to happen is it's just going to be picked with the lighting that it arrives at by default, which is quite bright, as you can see here. That because we've got a directional light permanently lit, it is picking up that directional light even though the rest of the scene has darkened down a bit. As you can see, you can also spot the other objects in here that don't have use probes ticked. It's quite obvious that this tree that I've used doesn't have probes ticked, whereas the other ones, like these ones for instance, are using light probes, and they're picking up the changes to the overall environment. it does actually give you a very clear distinction. You can immediately see which objects I've missed when I did my first upload of this environment, because it is actually much prettier in the day than it is at night, as you can see. Nonetheless, the skybox shader we were talking about does also have a night sky option. You can drag in a cube map containing a star field, and that will cover off. That will get used when the lighting dips below a certain level. Okay. So immediately we're in the scene, but we've run into the exact same issue. The preview that we've got does give you somewhat of an accurate preview, but we're just going to switch that off. I'm going to take this back into day. Immediately I'm going to fix that as well while I'm at it. I believe it's these. Well, let's find a sample object that is impacted. Okay, big waterfall. Which trees? Those little trees. So it's these ones. Let's have a look at these guys and see just if that's the case. They have light probes offed, so as you can see immediately that's the problem. So I'm actually going to go back to the original ones, because I've used these in a whole bunch of places. I'm just going to select all of them and do it all at once. So I'm just going to grab these. As you can see, I've got all these objects selected. We can just edit them all from a single tick. You just hold down Control to select multiple items. So I'm just going to hit Blend Probes, and now our lighting on these trees is going to be a bit better as well. And that will mean that at night they're no longer going to be going nuclear. However, in the interests of today's little demo, I'm actually going to switch the day-night system off for the minute. And we can take a look at this object we just added. I'm just saving the scene. See how long that takes to flip back in. I mean, these are all the things that you need to sort of just keep in mind if you're building scenes with day-night, is that if you do use baked lighting and things on those scenes to make things look better, just make sure you've got all the various options and things ticked. They do default to on, so you do have to explicitly turn those things off. But if you, for instance, buy assets from the asset store, which is what I've done here, you need to make sure that those don't happen. Trilo just mentioned in our in-world crowd that having light probes on scene will, trees will break instancing. That is true. Depending on the number of objects you've got in the scene, that will matter or it might not matter. The way around that is to play around with the environmental lighting. You can modify that through scripting to sort of impact those objects with the day-night environment. But yes, that is something to be aware of. Instancing is useful if you've got many tens of thousands or more of trees in a scene. In fact, I think it needs to be more than tens or thousands to really sort of give the impact we're looking for. Okay, so here's our little busted dude with his silly walk. We'll just go find our... Oops. So now I'm actually on the platform zone. Now nothing's changed immediately, but when I click this, you'll see that the avatar is actually moving around with the platform. Now the platform has a buoyancy on it. The water zone is in there, and that's what it's interacting with. As you can see, a couple of little markers tell it where the buoyancy of the water is. Now first things first is our water zone might be a little bit too high, so I'm going to lower that down a bit. So let's see. There we go. That's our moving object, and since the avatar is on here, it will move with the object. So if I grab this object and I move it around the scene, which I'm going to do, we'll see that the avatar is moving with it. Whoa! It's a bit of a sudden jerky movement, but this also works with vehicles. So you can make a pickup truck with a platform zone in the back of the pickup truck, and all the avatars that are in there will move with the object as it moves around. Particularly for vehicles and things, it can be useful if you're building something like an elevator or a platform that moves side to side. These platform zones do let you play around with that and get things going. Quickly, we're almost back at the day here. Let's start to show off this scene, particularly. The daytime is quite spectacular versus the nighttime. Unfortunately, we've still got our nuclear trees there that we just fixed. One thing you will notice is that as I move particularly quickly up or down, that there's a bit of a, you'll see bit of a jerk there on the Simono. You can play around with that with your post zone. That is because of the draw distance in the scene. If you specify a lower draw distance, you'll get more accuracy on the various textures that are happening, and those won't happen. That's a particular issue with Simono, but you might see similar artifacts in other regions. Okay, so we're back to this scene. Next things that I wanted to cover off. The post zone, we can talk about how I've got the various posts in here. The post for this scene is specified through a post profile. That was covered in the second lighting masterclass very early on. But you can just find the post here. There is one option in the legacy set, so most of these settings are ignored. There is one option that's an exception to that. Well, there's two options that are exception to that. The first is, we'll just show the post profile in here. As you can see, I've got most things switched off in the environment. I do have reflections enabled. I'm actually suspecting that I don't need reflections in here just because there is nothing really in the scene that's metallic and needs real-time reflections, so we can boost the frame rate immediately if I switch that off. The rest I'm going to leave on. We will anti-aliasing, ambient occlusion, eye adaptation. That is something we do have in the scene. Particularly, you'll notice if we go into particularly bright areas, the avatar will get a bit darker by comparison. The avatar is normally quite white, but if we get into a scene that there's lots of white, it will darken down to a more natural colour. Whereas if it's a small object in this particular scene, with the overall brightness, you'll see that the shirt becomes immediately quite nuclear. We have eye adaptation on here. That basically means that the scene's lighting will be adjusted, or the camera's tone mapping, which converts the lighting values into what's rendered on screen, will be adjusted over time the same way our eyes naturally adjust to changes in light. And by doing that, it means that you'll sort of get a more consistent view. And when you begin to move into dark areas of the scene, so we'll just go through this area here, you'll see that this goes from being quite bright, and immediately it's going to, if we go somewhere dark, this will begin to brighten back up again, even though it's not terribly well lit. In fact, we can go into somewhere darker in the scene. You also get these sort of transition effects through the HDR as you go through the environment. So it immediately feels sort of more natural for what the environment is, and you can actually be able to see what's going on even though the areas are quite well lit. They'll immediately sort of become useful and visible again fairly quickly. We also have bloom on, which obviously you can see is almost everywhere. I have set the bloom to have a dirt texture, which is a sort of a camera effect. So this texture here is actually being applied to the camera around the edges, as you can see in the scene. The tone mapping is mostly normal, although I think I have boosted some of the greens and the blues a little bit, just to sort of match a reference image that I was looking at the time. If we go down to the color grading, you'll see that I think it's on the sat versus sat, hue versus sat. I have actually, yes, I boosted the yellows, the greens, the blues, or the cyan-ish colors, and then the rest I've left mostly alone. And that's just basically mean that the tree leaves in particular have a more impactful effect on the scene that sort of looks a bit closer to how it would look if it was rendered in, for instance, gamma lighting. Okay, alright, so next things that we were going to cover off. Something I did actually want to add to this scene was a third-party asset. There's one called the Flock system. I don't know if I actually got this one in here. No, I do not. So I might just grab that from the asset store. And we'll just open that up quickly. I wanted to add this one, but we've used them in the Welcome Center. You'll notice that this is one of our supported extensions. It's a group by Unluck Software. Their bird system, you can use it in scenes. I do have them all. Unfortunately, my assets list is huge, so this will take a little bit of time to load. I might leave that loading in the background, and eventually it'll get back to normal. The other things I actually wanted to do was actually get a proper house template in here. I've got a couple of places that I want to put a few templates in here. We've got an upcoming feature which will allow you to delegate areas of a region to particular builders, and one of the things is that I'd like to actually make sure this scene is prepared for it. So I've left two big spaces for a house template to go. first one's up here on the top of this rock. It's mostly flat and empty for a reason. And the second is down on this side of the beach. I was going to drop something down there as well, so you've got sort of 2 placement zones in this particular region, so you can share it with a friend. So one of the things I'll do is I'll just grab some of the parts and pieces. I've got this pack which has got a whole bunch of tropical island building components. As you can see, that there's sort of some pre-built structures, but there's also all the pieces that are attached to them. We can set it up as a room floor as we go. So just hope this is loaded yet. I'll just grab, I think it's called Flock. That'll load in a second. The more assets you have, unfortunately, the longer it takes to load, and when you've got a collection that's sort of several years old, it does certainly take its time. Now, if you've got 2 particular objects, I should probably just going to copy this one. There's a couple of ways of working to make sure your objects are snapped together. This is something I haven't really covered before, but if I duplicate this one, I can hold down first Control and build along a grid. Now, this is already aligned because this creator has helpfully decided to build along a grid. Not all creators do, unfortunately, or if you're grabbing things from a different pack or different objects. And to align those together, what we can do is we can say, we can use the vertex alignment tools that are built into Unity, and we can actually snap 2 vertices together directly. And the way to do that is to hold down the V key. When you hold down the V key, you'll see that the cursor changes and a snap to a vertex. You've got selected the nearest one. If you click and then hold, it will then let you drag to another vertex in the scene. So in this case, it's a vertex that's on this object here. And if we view in wireframe, shaded wireframe, you'll immediately see the vertex that it's snapping to, so you can just go from here to here. That is a useful thing when aligning things precisely, because it'll give you absolute precision, especially across objects that are not built across an even grid, or particularly well sort of constructed against those. Or if it's your own objects, or you've got things that are working between 2 different grids that don't have a direct numerical correlation, it's one way of getting things together. This one's got it. Okay, so I'll just grab this bird flock bundle. This is something that, as I said, is supported by our systems. There's a whole bunch of them. There's pre-made with pre-existing birds, but if you buy any of them and just take the script out, the script will work with your own assets as and when you build them. Something to watch out for when you actually import packages. This one's probably okay. Yes, it is. But if you do see folders named standard assets in the list here, just untick them. Just untick the whole folder. Standard assets is a group of assets that come with Unity, and it also comes with our editor pack. And unfortunately, versions that other people bundle tend to be a little bit out of date and can cause problems. If you do run into that problem, re-importing our editor pack will often fix them. Failing that, delete the directory named standard assets that came in with it, and it'll probably be okay. Just give this a second. Sometimes you'll also see these errors that, about an obsolete script or API. Those can be pretty much waved through automatically. For the most part, the upgrade just works. You don't often really need to back up your whole project beforehand. Likewise, if you ever see that on our editor packs, it is safe to click the "It's okay to update" button. If there is ever a time that it's not, we will let people know. But for the most part, that just works and can be ignored. That said, for backups, there is a couple of routes which I haven't really talked about before as part of my editor packs, as my masterclasses. There is a couple of ways of working on a project that can keep it secure and to keep your assets behaving. I generally recommend avoiding storing your project folder inside of a Dropbox folder, but if you use a versioning system like Git or SVN, those can be better. With Git, make sure that you've got large file support enabled, because the files of individual textures and things are much larger than what Git is designed to handle. SVN is what we use internally for versioning art projects. Generally speaking, SVN works pretty well, even if you've got huge files and huge repositories. The one that we work from for all of our sort of built-in scenes, like the Welcome Center and things, that particular SVN folder actually is in the hundreds of gigabytes of data at this point in time. We just have one big one. The benefit of working with SVN is also you've got the revisioning, so you can roll back individual changes that people made, but it also provides a somewhat of a backup system. If you make a horrible mistake, you can revert back to the version that you've committed into SVN. And it's not a bad strategy to go for. If you've got that SVN externally hosted, that also covers the off-site hosting part of your backup solution. Just give this a second to come through. how's that scene looking? We're back to sort of the night cycle here again. I also need to fix those weeds. Actually, just logging into a scene particularly will give you an information on exactly what's working and what's not. So obviously 1 or 2 test uploads through our creator grid will let you work out and iron out all the problems. These problems, as you saw before, though, were visible when you hit play on the editor mode. They should generally pop up straight away if you're using the day-night cycle, for example, and need to test it. Mostly is what you see is what you get. So we've got this flock controller. I'm going to go grab some pigeons. Actually, no, I'll go with seagulls. It's more appropriate. This particular component basically just lets you drag and drop a whole bunch of let's go free run flock. Bring this into the scene. Make this area a bit bigger. These guys. This one also has the ability to place landing points, which can be quite useful when you've got those in an environment. And to do that, you just create an empty child. I believe it's. I need to look up exactly which one it is. I may have bought an old version of this project in here too, but let's have a look. Birdflock scripts. Landing spot controller. You just place a landing spot controller on one, and then on child of that you add landing spot. And then what you can do is you can use the Control-Shift F key to align something with the position of the camera. So I'm just lining something up here now. You Control-Shift F, and my landing spot has moved to where my camera was. So I'll just add a couple of these, and this is actually where the birds will land. If you've used our welcome center, this is exactly how they're made. The little knob will actually indicate what the rotation is, just so that's what the natural position is. You can just add tons and tons and tons of these through the scene. Just a worthwhile little trick. Okay, so we hit play on this one. We'll actually get a whole bunch of seagulls through the scene now as well, which was what I was anticipating adding to the finished product. Give it a second to save. It's a big scene with lots of light map data and things. Incidentally, the export size on this one is about 200 meg right now. It's not quite big enough to fit into the free region plan. It is big enough to fit into the $5 a month plan that we've got with some room to spare. That said, this has not been optimized at all. There's quite a few places that I actually want to take for optimizing the scene content. We did discuss that in the optimization class. But one of the big things that I want to do in here is actually switch all the materials over to using algorithmic substances, particularly things like the rocks, the grass, those kinds of things, because I think they are the bulk of the texture work in here. The trees probably are adding a chunk to it, but I'm fairly sure that it's the environmental materials that are actually using up the bulk of the file size in here. And we can actually check that out in a second. I'll load up the tool just before we finish up, which will be in just a minute to show off how that goes. And hopefully this scene will be done after another weekend or two, and we'll be able to put it into the store, and you can take this one as your personal house. There we go. So I've got our little interactive bird flock. Now this bird flock script is actually not terribly complicated. If you were going to write your own, you could do so pretty easily. You wouldn't need a lot of work to add it. It's just a basic Boyd's flocking algorithm, which could be implemented in our Lua system. In fact, there's a few things we've got coming down the pipeline, including the new pets, which I haven't shown off yet properly, but are actually in the latest updates that we've released. There. So sorry. Finally, last thing I'll do is I'll just show off some of the things we've got for inspecting file size. Now the old system was the one you could access off the scene settings, which you could scroll down here. You can see there's the output inspector, and this will tell you how much and what's using file size in here. I think I've got some tiki torches that have got 4,096 textures on them. That would be a prime candidate for getting rid of, because it's adding 20 megs of data alone. I suspect once we get rid of that one, it'll probably cut the file size quite considerably just alone on there. We have also added a new tool. This one's a bit experimental, but it's in the very latest editor packs, which is our bitmap to material support. And this window is similar to the other ones. It actually can be used as a useful inspector, even despite the fact that you may not have bitmap to material. If you've got bitmap to material, which is a tool that converts things to substances, basically converts your static textures to procedural textures, you can actually see here it'll give you a material by material breakdown of the upload size, the stored file size, which is the size that it'll be exported out as. That's how much it'll add to your region's weight. And then finally we've got the resident size, which is short for the amount of virtual memory that the client PCs will have to have. So the amount of VRAM needed to visit your region is generally speaking going to be roughly on par with the total sum of this last value here. Keeping your VRAM low is probably the biggest way you can lower lag on your particular scenes. We do have, through our performance sliders, they will actually cut the texture resolution by half each time. The very lowest quality settings that we offer will cut the resolution by about 3/4, which will free up quite a bit of VRAM, but you also may want to take a hang of that one, because you really shouldn't assume that clients have more than maybe 1.5 gig of VRAM on the average computer. While high-end video cards do sell with 3 to 6 gig these days, the vast bulk of clients actually accessing these environments have substantially less. Okay, at that point I'm going to finish up. Next week I'm going to cover off a few things just to finish up this scene. What I want to do is I want to get a boat in the scene that you can drive around, and we'll put one of these platform zones that I showed off earlier on the back. We'll play around with a few other bits and pieces. We'll try and hopefully finish off this building so we can just set up the room for components and things, which I wanted to do a little bit more of last week, and we'll actually sort of get some interactivity and things in the in-world build tools. But besides that, we are almost ready to go on this scene. It's almost ready for release. Alright, thank you all for watching, and I will be back next week, same time, and we'll be finishing off this scene.